Okay, good afternoon. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. Welcome to NUPI. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this seminar today with Andy Moravchik, Professor Andy Moravchik from Princeton University. And he has a long title here, All Bark and No Bite, Why Populist Foreign Policies Are Doomed to Disappoint. As all of you know, in European countries, most European countries actually, have seen a wave of populism coming into politics in general, and also to foreign policy. We see this in UK, in Hungary, in France, in Italy, in Germany. Even this weekend we had an election in Germany, also in the Nordic countries. But and then a lot of us, many of us, have engaged. Should we be worried about this? Is this likely to have any impact on foreign policy in general, and will it have any impact on the European Union or these leading scholars on European integration? He has written a book that many of us have read called The Choice for Europe, and he has also been consistently arguing for a liberal intergovernmentalist approach to the study of European integration. He is not only a very good and solid academic, firmly rooted, I would say, in some kind of historical approach to international relations, but he's also developed an analytical model and theories of European integration and international relations in general that many of us have been inspired by, and we look at it and admire, not least because he's always provoking, but also very transparent and clear in his argument. And now he's engaging in this topic on populism and foreign policy, and we very much look forward to that. We met earlier today and we said that what we try to do at NUPI is to do academic work, but also to do something that is relevant for public life and decision making. And I think this topic in itself is really important, a part of the ongoing European discussion about where Europe is heading. And just two small things to say about Andy, in addition to his impressive academic work on international relations. He, as some of you know, he's also the editor of the book review section of Western Europe in Foreign Affairs. And many of you perhaps read Newsweek when it was at its peak, and Andy was then writing a column on Europe at the time. So he's also very much engaged in, I would say, bringing academic life into public affairs and a wider readership. Of course, last but not least, Andy Moravchik and his wife, Anne-Marie Slaughter, has also made very significant contributions to the life of how to think about and to improve gender balance, not only in international relations, but in academic life as well. And I think both of them were 2 or 3 years ahead of the Me Too movement. But they led to huge interest and rethinking, I think, at a lot of academic institutions about how to improve a better gender balance. So Andy will give his talk for 45 minutes or around that. And then we will have 2 comments, prepared comments. One by research fellow Minda Holm. She's a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. She's also affiliated to DEES, but we're also very proud to say that you're also a colleague here at NUPI. So you're a colleague with many hats. And then Pernille Riker, she's a research professor here at NUPI. She will make her comments as well, and she's coordinating our research on European Union here at NUPI. So, Andy, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's my first time in Oslo, and we spent a wonderful day. I understand the weather is always like this in Oslo, so but my wife and I walked from end to end of the city back and forth. It's wonderful. And I appreciate you bringing me here on a topic that is not yet really my area of professional expertise. So I am a scholar on the European Union, not so much on populism. And over the last few years, I've given some talks on populism, particularly focusing on Trump and making a similar argument that Trump talks more than he does. In this talk, I'll talk more about Europe. But this is an area that is very much a work in progress, and so what I would really appreciate is feedback about how to study this more subtly or more rigorously or more accurately. So I'm going to I was introduced as somebody who provokes, so I will make a very simple argument, and that's that in the 21st century, democratic populist foreign policies are unsustainable. What do I mean? That right-wing populist leaders don't actually achieve much of what they aspire to or what they rhetorically seem to invoke. Instead, they end up adopting policies that are pretty conventional. The policies that were there before, the policies of the opposition or the consensus, or maybe the policies of a political coalition on their side. So I'm going to provide some evidence for you that this is true in Europe today, and then I'm going to look at why this must be true, and that's more theoretical, right? Why is it not just a chance that these people, or lack of time, that they failed to achieve these things, but why is there a systematic reason why it's true? And if I have time, why no one seems to notice that it's all bark and no bite. So this is contrasted to the conventional view of the European Union today, which is a view of crisis, and indeed the Western world as a whole. My colleague at Princeton, John Eikenberry, talks about the fundamental threat to the liberal order in the world today being populism. In Europe, the conventional view, so I'm briefly speaking as an academic here, is that we live in a post-functional world where national interests are no longer those they traditionally were, economics or achieving certain goals, but instead ideology. They're driven by ideology, and that's what we're seeing countries do. That this creates a kind of zero-sum conflict. Countries can't cooperate with each other when they all believe these different doctrines, or it creates fundamental conflicts. And people cite a series of examples. They cite Brexit, they cite Le Pen, Orban, Kaczynski, Salvini, all the rogues gallery of populists for being the people who are stopping Europe from being what it can be. Okay, the alternative view then is that in fact European Union still is capable of and motivated by achieving practical goals. Populists are really more bark than bite. They don't actually deliver on these things. Why? Because electorally they're weak. It's actually pretty difficult for a populist party to get very many votes in most European countries, and I'll provide the evidence in a moment. And when they do actually get into government, they can't achieve most of what they want, as opposed to the functional concerns that their countries have. In fact, these end up to be essentially one-issue parties concerned with migration, and migration is now an issue where different political parties have different stated positions, but their policy position is restrictionist everywhere. Not just everywhere in Europe, but everywhere in the Western world. So they don't actually change very much. And you can cite all the same examples to show that that's true. So that's what I'm going to do today. So let's start with the beginning. In foreign policy, extreme right-wing populists really don't achieve very much. What do I mean? I mean they don't transform EU politics. So we're going to focus on EU cooperation as an example of this more broadly. I'm happy in questions to speak about Trump or any other examples. Now, let me qualify this so you understand exactly what I'm saying. Exception one, they do achieve symbolic policies. So they do change the rhetoric of international politics. They do often issue declarations, even multilateral declarations. And there are issues like migrant quotas, I will argue, which are totally unimportant, even in some sense fake issues in Europe, that populist parties have had some effect on. That's pretty much the only one, but I will argue that it doesn't matter much. And they lend their support to broadly accepted consensual policies, and those include external migration to the EU. Everybody's restrictionists, so are the populists. That's why Europe now has a closed migration policy like the United States, like Japan, like everybody else. And they do things in domestic politics. So my talk is about foreign policy. I don't approve of or seek to diminish, for example, the effects of the Hungarian government on its own domestic politics. In fact, my relatives are Hungarian, so I argue with them a lot about this. But that's not the topic of my talk. Okay, so we move on just to some examples so you can see just what's actually been going on. Example one is Austria, where you have the FPÖ. So you've had two bouts of the FPÖ getting into government. First with Schüssel, where they achieved little and were then kicked out of government. And then most recently with the Kurz coalition. What happens? First of all, Kurz pursues remarkably pro-European policies, has a very successful European presidency, supports all kinds of things like enlargement, cooperation on migration, foreign aid, economic integration. He holds the successful presidency, and then the extremists are weakened and kicked out of office. So in the latest voting, you can see that the FPÖ voter share goes down by 10% out of only 27% that they had before. Italy. What happens in Italy? We have Matteo Salvini. Salvini's a big talker. So, in fact, he's hilarious to read if you read him in Italian, because he says things that are politically incorrect but true. Like Emmanuel Macron is a hypocrite, a hypocrite, and a chatterbox, which, yeah, I mean, it's right. But he's been in office twice at the national level without having much effect on EU or foreign policy. He favors migration restrictions, but so does everyone in Italy. And in fact, the government responsible for the migration restrictions that have been so effective in Italy recently is the previous technocratic government that was in office, or the government of the left. And what's sort of galling, I think, to people in Italy is that Matteo Salvini claims credit for policies that actually the moderates and the centrists put into place. He no longer speaks of a referendum or of leaving Europe at all, or even of leaving EMU, but instead of reforming the EU from within, because he thinks there's no other way to get elected. And he was pushed out of government anyway in May 2019. He may come in again in a right-wing coalition, but it's hard to believe that his policies will be more radical. And we get to our friend Orban. So the interesting thing about Orban and Fidesz is they're actually cooperative on almost everything that the EU actually does. I had the opportunity to ask Francesca Mogherini a simple question. I said to her, name me the things that the Hungarians and Poles have stopped you from doing. She said, they never stopped me from doing anything, except for 2 weeks. And they go out and give a speech, and then they say, go ahead. Two EU exceptions are migrant quotas and rule of law. So again, the quota issue, that would have only applied to 1,300 migrants going to Hungary. Hungary actually took those 1,300 migrants anyway, but Orban took the opportunity to give a speech and win a referendum at 95% in his favor, so he made domestic political hay out of this. But in fact, the policy was never a policy designed to solve the migrant crisis. It was designed to give the Germans political cover for taking more migrants. And it isn't a very technocratically sensible policy to be shipping migrants to Poland or to Portugal anyway. And of course, on rule of law, the domestic issue. So I don't want to belittle that, but again, we're talking about foreign policy. And so this quota issue demonstrates not that Orban is influential in the EU, but that he's a skilled manipulator of rhetoric, that he can bark really well, but when he has to bite, he doesn't do much. Final case, Poland. It looks almost exactly like Hungary, almost exactly the same story, except the Poles actually take 1 to 2 million Ukrainian migrants while they're arguing against migration policy elsewhere and arguing for Britain and other countries to take more polls. So their position is kind of all over the place, very opportunistic, and again, not influencing overall EU policy at all unless you care about old growth forests in eastern Poland, which I do because I come from Oregon in the United States, but not a major foreign policy issue. We could go through all the other cases where populists have gotten into power. But basically, the case that populism makes any difference in Europe comes down to one case. It's almost 100% dependent on Brexit. And I will admit that the Brexiteers got further than I thought they would, and further than they should have, because they benefited from an extremely lucky set of circumstances over and over again. But nonetheless, even if you look at Brexit, the one case, first, it's exceptional. So Britain has always been, for 50 years, a country with 2 or 3 times more Euroscepticism than anybody else. It's not particularly populist, it's just always been true. Secondly, Brexit has yet to happen, and it's not clear it will happen. And if it does happen, it's not clear that it will really be substantive. My guess is that they will do some kind of a Brexit, and then Boris Johnson will win or lose an election. If he loses it, then Brexit may end. And if he wins it, then he has no further reason to want to push a strong Brexit agenda beyond the in name only, since Boris Johnson's only goal clearly is to be elected Prime Minister of the UK. And Brexit will not and cannot spread. So 5 years ago, it seemed like there were other people in Europe, Marine Le Pen and so on, and people had who were arguing for this in their countries. We saw all kinds of articles in The Economist and elsewhere about this. Now, nobody talks about that. And some people, like Orban, never talked about it, because this is basically a politically suicidal strategy almost anywhere else but Britain. So then if you generalize this, what do you see? So you see a chart that looks like this. So what does this chart show? It takes all the extreme populist parties in Europe. I don't know where these little red lines came from. It's interesting, they weren't in my original, but that's what the internet does to you. Okay. I thought maybe it was the Russians looking at my slides when I sent them to you. So this is the votes that populists got in the last legislative election. So you'll see pretty quickly, after you get past the usual suspects, the UK, Hungary, Poland, and these are actually very generously populist codings. Like, it's not quite clear that the ruling party in Czech Republic is really a populist party, but let's say it is. You quickly go down to a level where these are fairly marginal, and there are quite a few countries where basically populism is non-existent in Europe. The trend looks more or less the same. If you look at a one-year trend, it's not as if populists are expanding everywhere. They're going up and down, and pretty much it looks the same. Do they get into government? Well, fewer. So here we had 3 countries, Italy, Finland, Austria, where populists were in government but are no longer. Slovakia, one of the 2 populist parties is in government, not the other. So you're here. And are they a majority of that government? Well, then you only have Hungary and the UK. Then what do when they get into government? Here we have foreign policy, and basically migrant quotas is the issue. It's a great issue to focus on because it doesn't mean very much, and it makes everybody angry, and you can win referenda, but the only country that's actually going for more in the migration area or opposes the universal policy in Europe of restricting migration is Britain, where it's unclear because they are actually looking at changing intra-EU migration. And then when you look at other foreign policy issues, the only country that actually has a serious agenda to alter other foreign policy issues in the EU is Britain. And then finally, these countries, were they get elected, were they to get into government, were they to go beyond migration, would have to implement these policies, often in agreement with other countries. But since the populists are such a small number, it's very difficult for them to achieve very much, and so we just end up basically with migrant quotas as the issue. the only issue where people have had a lot of success. Okay, so that's what the world looks like. So let's go to question 2. Why must it look like this? Okay, now we've already seen the obstacles that a populist has to overcome. They need to get votes. They need to get into government even though they have the votes. They need to then push the government in coalition to adopt their issues. And then they need to prevail in negotiating with other countries. And these things are very difficult. But to see exactly how they're difficult, we need a theory of populist foreign policy doctrine and behavior. Why is bark different than bite, right? So here, let's think about what a populist doctrine of foreign policy looks like. So I went, because I'm not a scholar of populism, but a scholar of the EU, I went to the literature on populism. And what I found was something very interesting, that almost nobody studies this, what populists actually get done in foreign policy. So it's a surprisingly small literature on policy at all. When you do have that literature, almost all of it is about domestic policies. And what foreign policy analysis there is almost all on migration. But that's tiny. So literally, when the first thing I did was I went to the Oxford Handbook on Populism, 850 pages like this, brand new book full of citations and everything. One paragraph on the foreign policy implications of populism. And the general literature on the effects of populism is indeterminate. So people used to say it didn't have much effect. Now you hear a lot more people saying it matters, particularly in the EU literature, those post-functionalists I talked about. But the evidence is kind of all over the place. So my argument, simple argument, again, deliberately designed to be too simple and provocative, is that populists face an inherent tension between rhetoric and reality, and that bark and no bite is the best possible policy for a populist politician. This is what they should want to do. Because barking satisfies the populist base. That section of the right-wing electorate that's nationalist, likes to hear all this stuff, but isn't very well informed, doesn't really know much about the issues, and not biting satisfies the powerful and better informed interest groups like business and so on. You can see this in the British Conservative Party, split between these more business-oriented groups and the nationalists. It also avoids a completely failed policy, right? So if you were to lurch into a hard Brexit and all of a sudden there were going to be trucks 50 kilometers long at the British border, this looks bad for the populists. So you don't want to actually get too far into implementation. You can see this kind of thing in Trump. Here we have a cartoon. I used this because the last talk I gave was at to a group that included a lot of undergraduates. This is actually a cartoon by an undergraduate at Boston University. And here we have Trump and Kim Jong-un being all bark and no bite. Another example of a policy in America that looks exactly like the policy the previous administration pursued, except for the talk. Okay, so let's go through what populist foreign policy doctrine is, and then why it's doomed to run into reality in a way that makes it unimplementable. So what is the foreign policy doctrine of populism? Again, I've had a hard time finding any literature on this, so I kind of made this up. And you may think that it's not optimal, so I'm very open to criticism on this point. So the first question you ask is, what do states want? What are their national interests in a populist worldview? Okay, and the answer is, national values and interests are consensual at home. Everybody agrees on the same things, but conflictual abroad. Maybe conflictual is a little too strong a word, but incompatible with those of other countries. What do I mean by this? Populists think this because they believe either one of two things. Either they believe that the interests of countries come, in this populist worldview, from collective symbols, and those symbols are national and specific to the country. So basically, the populist tries to get a doctrinal or rhetoric of international politics that comes from invoking nationalism, patriotism, sovereignty, independence, language, religion, identity, and culture. Or, secondarily, they may believe that the material world is such that interests conflict. So think about Trump's belief that trade surpluses are the way to think about whether your country is doing well. If you export more than you import, right? That's an example where you generate a conception of international relations that makes it seem much more conflictual than the way, say, an economist would think about trade as a mutually beneficial transaction. What does this look like in reality? Think about Brexit, right? So here we have the rhetoric of Brexit, right? What's the aim of Brexit? It's not to achieve anything specific that you can and can't achieve with other countries. It's to achieve a status, to be a fully independent and self-governing country, to take back democratic control, to promote British identity, right? These are all things defined in conflict with what the EU and others is trying to force them to do. No wonder it's called UKIP, the UK Independence Party, right? And voter perceptions are precisely that we don't care about the precise interests of Britain, that's what a majority of people said, but instead we care about sovereignty per se. That taking decisions in Britain that are different than other people's decisions is the purpose of the policy, right? And so it is by definition conflictual, but also by definition consensual, because all British share independence, share sovereignty, share things like democratic control, or so the populists argue. And you can see this very clearly when you look at the posters and the way this is sold. You can see that it's Brexit or subservience, right, for everybody. You can also see this parentheses because they invoke Churchill. So here's, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, a general law of international relations. When anybody starts talking about Churchill, like George Bush did before he went into Iraq, we're in big trouble, all of us, right? Because Churchill is a man who was right once in history and wrong about almost everything else, an extreme individual. When people are thinking about doing something that everybody is telling them not to do, they quote Churchill. Actually, a better discusser of these incompatible values is Marine Le Pen, whose foreign policy discourse I actually kind of like, because she's very clear about this kind of stuff, that the nation is unicultural. It's defined by that culture. Every nation has its own history, its own culture, its own identity. And so they're fighting for the political liberty to do that. The best you can hope for in the world, therefore, is that every country will be sovereign and do its own thing. The worst that can happen is they actually fight. And she has a wonderful rip on international institutions, which have mysterious symbols and force everybody to speak this strange language called English, and so on. So I'll go on to Orban. So Orban has the same kind of discourse, and also strangely ambivalent. The Hungarian model rests on the family, nation, and Christian freedom. And then this Christian Europe, which other countries could in theory embrace, but don't, is posed against mixed race nations, NGOs paid for by foreign interest groups, and these same horrible Brussels people speaking English rather than Hungarian. So that's the first part of it, right? That we assume this kind of world. Secondly, so you might ask yourself, if all these countries are conflicting with each other, how does the populist assure their voters that they're going to win, that they're going to actually advance their interests against all in this very conflictual world, right? And the answer to that question for populists is, we really want it more than them, right? This is what Trump tells you. I will bargain harder because it's not just I'm an incredibly good bargainer, but we really want this to happen. And this, you really see this with the British, but also with the Hungarians. So here we have, and if you want to put this in international relations theory language, more determined parties win because they have more willpower, and that willpower means that they will take more risk, they will bear more cost, they will accept worse unilateral options in order to prevail. Okay? So here you see it, right? So you think I'm not strong enough to look after myself, just watch me, right? The whole thing is this Churchillian notion, we want it more than them. And so we're going to win. Marine Le Pen, again, is more subtle, more intellectual, but the idea is basically that if you aren't a cowardly leader or an indecisive leader like the previous French, you're willing to spend a lot more money on defense, and you can go out there and defend France everywhere in the world. So she literally wants to increase French defense spending by 50%, right? But why? Because she has more willpower than these gutless people who have been governing France. Okay, so that's the second principle. You win because you want it. What's the third principle? The principle is what answers the question, what institutions and expertise do you need? And the answer is none. Why? Because foreign policy is simple and intuitive. Everybody really knows how to achieve what you want. Usually the answer is by just unilaterally going out there and grabbing it. So for example, when David Davis, the former British minister for Brexit, was asked, how is Britain going to negotiate all these trade agreements when they don't have any trade negotiators? He said, if we can deal with World War II, we can deal with this, right? I mean, it's a non-answer, but it gives you this idea. It's simple, what we want to do, and we really want to do it, so we're just going to get it done. Okay, so that is the foreign policy doctrine of populists. And the problem with it is that it's not right. It's pretty much that simple. The world is not like the populists describe it to be. What populists tell their base about foreign policy to justify it is false. And what happens is, after an election, policy moves from the phase of justification to a mass public to the phase of implementation. And when you implement, then all the people who have specific interests in a policy come out of the woodwork. You can't really rely so much on the public because they don't understand or even know what you're doing. And the result is that the politics change. So even if you're able to get into office, you end up not being able to or not wanting to implement what you say you're going to do. So populist foreign policy is invalid. Let's go through the three elements again. Domestic politics is not consensual, like the populists say. It's pluralist at home, but international politics is largely cooperative. So it's the opposite of what the populists said. International politics often has great cooperative opportunities that you can't overcome, and domestic politics is often pluralist and very conflictual. Let's take this one first, domestic politics. So again, remember that chart. What populists have to do is win a vote share, join a ruling coalition, impose their foreign policy strategy on domestic coalition, bureaucracy, and social groups, and then reach an international agreement with other countries. And that is almost impossible, coming from as an extreme position as theirs. So again, if you look at this, you can divide this chart into three categories with these dark lines. So you have countries where there's substantial support, you really have a majoritarian government, you have some broader foreign policy goals, and even then we're not really sure how much the British are going to achieve. Then you've got your countries where you have substantial support, you get into government, and then you start haggling with everybody else in your country about whether or not you're going to implement a populist policy, and it gets watered down until we're pretty much just looking at quotas. Then you've got these countries where parties are fairly, medium strong, but they can't get into office. And then you've got countries where populism isn't a significant force at all. And when you get to this last phase, and you want to implement a policy collectively with other nations, you're going to have a mass of countries that are opposed to your policy. So even if you were able to achieve this domestically, you have a hard time negotiating your way through. Let me give you some examples. So Marine Le Pen got an incredible amount of press for getting as far as the second round of the French presidential elections. How much power does the Rassemblement National have in France today? Okay, here it is. She got beaten 2-1 in the 2017 presidential election, about as bad as anybody gets beaten. She has 7 of 577 people in the Assemblée Nationale, 1 of 348 senators, no regional council presidencies, some members of regional councils, no departmental council presidencies, very few departmental council members, and some MEPs. That's pretty much it, right? And you're not going to run a country like that or even have a significant influence. You saw the same thing. And so what's Marine Le Pen's response to this? Marine Le Pen's response to this is to moderate her policy. Unsuccessfully, but nonetheless she moderates it. So in 2014, she favored Frexit and leaving the euro. By the time she was contesting elections and right afterward, she had very inflammatory rhetoric, but ambiguity. And then now she's taken Salvini's position that we have to reform Europe from within, and we're going to stay in there and stay within the euro. So populist politicians moderate their behavior to meet electoral goals and still can't have power in their countries. Similarly, at the European level, just for the record, this was the change from the old European Parliament to the current European Parliament by party. And if you break it all down, basically the only change, because of the British Conservatives and the Brexit Party, was a shift in the composition of Eurosceptic forces, but the total Eurosceptic forces stay roughly the same. So again, we're looking at a Europe that is structurally designed to make it difficult to achieve it. This kind of thing. Now, the other half of it is that international politics is positive sum, right? It's easy to talk as if you completely disagree with the policies of every other country in the world. But when you're actually carrying out trade policy, regulatory policy, banking policy, and everything, security policy, your interests overlap. So what do we see? Take Brexit. Britain, we find, depends on Europe, right? So Britain started making concessions from day one of the Brexit negotiations on all kinds of issues. For example, exempting all Britons in Europe and all Europeans in Britain from any kind of limitation of the migration status, an attempt to generate free trade. In fact, the ironic thing about the Brexit negotiations is that the British were in the position of saying, why are you Europeans being so unfair and not letting us keep all the stuff we have? Right? Because they want all the stuff they have. Hungary and Poland are the same. These governments never question membership in the EU. You never hear them do that because they are the biggest beneficiaries on the entire continent. They're playing a double game of criticizing. So you can see this pictorially. Here we have Brexit. Basically, whatever the future legal status of Britain, it's going to look very much like it is today. This is the so-called Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. Here's Hungary. Hungary is the dog that barks, that bites the hand that feeds it. That should be a barking dog if I keep my metaphors completely straight, but you get the notion. All right, the second point, bargaining. So you remember Populist said, we just have to want it more and we'll get it. But what do we see? What we see is that asymmetrical interdependence, that is your dependence on other countries, is not just a matter of how much your party wants something. It's a fact in the world, right? So the British pretend as if they can just live without Europe, we're fine. But when you listen to the rhetoric, look at that very closely. If you go to buy a house and you tell the person you're buying from, this is the only house I'm going to buy, does the price tag go up or down? Of course, we all have options open to us. That's the only responsible in a negotiation. So he says. But in fact, to a very substantial extent, Europe is the only house that Britain is negotiating with. They're doing like any home buyer and pretending not to care so much about Europe, but in point of fact, they do. And this asymmetry in power between Europe and Britain is objective, right? It comes from the fact that UK has enough common interests so a hard Brexit is impossible. We see this. Parliament will not support a hard Brexit. And I think Boris Johnson is faking it if he thinks he's in favor of it. And the interdependence relationship favors Europe, right? Britain exports 4 times as much or 3 times as much as a percentage of GDP to Europe as Europe exports to it. So the British will be hurt much harder. And Britain's outside options are poor, which is to say, suppose Britain was kicked out of the European Union, what they're going to do is start negotiating with China, with the United States, with India. And so you see this. Our plan is quite simple, really. We'll just roll up our sleeves and make our own trade agreements. Well, like what sane person wants to do this, right? So if you have bad outside options and you're very dependent on somebody else, sooner or later, you are going to concede. Same thing with Hungary. Here we have a wonderful Italian cartoon, so I translated it for you. So here we have somebody asking Salvini, will you ask your friend Orban to accept his quota of migrants, which of course Orban won't do. And so the disagreement between populists is part of the reason they can't achieve very much. No, I'll ask him how to deny food to people in migrant camps. The lesson there is, if we're dealing with a domestic policy, and a relatively minor domestic policy, like how much food is in a migrant camp, which from a political point of view is relatively migrant, you can do that. But when it comes to actually having an international agreement where you start to commit other countries, it gets a whole lot more difficult. And finally, and very quickly, you have that third step. Policy making is complex, not simple. Remember, the populists told us it's simple, it's easy, things are easy. But what do we see when we look at Britain, again, and Brexit? We see that the complexity of managing information and expertise, of actually engineering a withdrawal from the EU, renders it almost impossible. A conservative estimate of the number of EU directives implemented by the UK Parliament is 35,000, and that doesn't include the ones that don't require parliamentary implementation. Then you have to renegotiate your WTO relationships with everybody, and there are, again, conservatively 100,000 different product categories in the WTO, and you're going to have to renegotiate them with 200 countries. Do the multiplication, okay? And your average trade agreement takes 20 years from negotiation to implementation. So for 20 years, Britain will be negotiating, what have we got here? 200 times 100,000 plus all this stuff. That is an enormous administrative burden, one out of the hands of any single country in real time. And the result of that is that Britain is going to have to simplify somehow by accepting common institutions like the customs union. Okay, so if you look at Britain, which we focused on right now, you can see the difference between the populist pitch and what happens at implementation. You frame it as a zero-sum conflict over ideas. We want our independence, our sovereignty, but you end up haggling over issues in which you have a common interest. Sheer willpower is not enough. Instead, you have to have real power. And most of these countries don't. Britain, at least, is in a decent shape to do it. Trump does a little bit better than European countries because he is a president of a genuinely powerful country. And Hungary and Poland have no chance whatsoever, right? And finally, there's the complexity that what appears simple when you sell it in an election turns out in the process of implementation to be complicated. Okay, so in 2 minutes, I want to raise one last question because I feel I've not been provocative enough. So I'm going to provoke you even more. Why do so many people believe that populism poses a fundamental threat to the European and liberal world order when I've shown you it doesn't? Okay? And I think there are 3 groups of people who exaggerate the populist threat because they have an incentive to do it. Okay? The first is politicians. It doesn't matter what kind of politicians. So populists don't generally listen to me, and being an academic, I'm not generally around them. But, but I get vicious attacks from the opponents of populism because they say you're belittling the populists. You're not taking it seriously as a threat. You're not being politically correct, okay? And politicians especially want to do this because they want to mobilize their base against the populist threat. Rightly so, in my estimation. But nonetheless, this leads them to exaggerate the populist threat in this area and others. Then you have journalists and commentators and policy analysts. Populism is great for journalism, really good. There was a TV discussion on our public broadcasting system after 1 year of Trump, and somebody said, Trump has made journalism so easy. They said, we wait till 4 o'clock, he tweets things out, we report them, and everybody reads them, right? What could be simpler? And journalists have no incentive to say, you know, when you look at it in detail, it doesn't seem like he's really implementing the, you know, quota agreement with Korea, which he didn't, right? But nobody comments on that. And finally, I'm sorry to say, scholars, people like us, I think in my profession also, there's a tendency to go after fashion to try to be relevant. My own view about the scholarly vocation and that of a policy analyst, being a recovered policymaker myself, is that it is our job to view things a little bit broader, a little bit deeper, a little bit longer than most people. And if you look at it that way, you find that populists in foreign policy are all bark and no bite. Thank you.
Andy, now you can go down and sit down there. Thank you so much. And then we have these two commentators, first Minda and then Pernilla, and then you invite you up again to make some comments. So thank you so much, Andy. And Minda, please.
Oh, thank you. So is this on? Yep. So thank you, Andrew, for that thought-provoking talk, which I know speaks to what many here in the room are interested in. And it also speaks very directly to some of the questions that I am grappling with in my own research. So on the one hand, I'm working on a theoretical PhD conceptualizing the concept of international counter-ideology and its limits to change. But then I also lead a far more policy-oriented 3-year research project for the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, where we're looking precisely at the international politics of the national right in Europe, US, and Russia, and what it means for European security and defense. So I have 2 comments that I will pair with 2 sets of questions. I will focus on the national right, since that's also my area of research, but I will conclude with a question on the left. So first, an observation. One thing that has struck me during my own research is that how we assess the radicalness of the nationalist right is dependent on how we conceptualize the system, the international system in the first place. That is, what is it that they seek to change? Although these actors, such as National Rally in France, such as Lega in Italy, such as Peace in Poland, although they rhetorically reject a certain liberal mode of governance that they perceive or claim as being forced upon them, it is not a revolution which they seek. And with the exception of Trump, who's of course here a singularity in many ways, one of them being that he represents the most powerful country on earth, there are limits to what their politics can and will do to the international system, at least in the foreseeable future. So here I agree with you, Andrew. On the other hand, and this is maybe somewhat of a provocative but also an obvious point, but for refugees and for women and for ethnic and sexual minorities, their policies have very much real-life consequences. We see this in terms of kind of increasingly restrictive policies. We see it in terms of a spike in hate speech, hate crime, and so on. And also in the extent to, and we see this also in Norway, but in the extent to which this form of rhetoric is becoming increasingly normalized and pervasive in society as such. Now, this might seem like a point on national policies, but I would argue that its scope and character has a very distinct international dimension. And is it one thing that has become increasingly clear in recent years is that this kind of rigid separation between the national and international, or national and foreign policy, has less analytical value when we're dealing with questions such as ideology. But in terms of consequences for foreign policy more narrowly defined, I agree with you that they're less radical both in aspirations and in what they can actually achieve than they give an impression of, at least in the European context. And I would be interested to hear more about your perspective on kind of Trump at this current stage and what he has achieved. But in part, it is, as you say, because they're working within the existing parliamentary systems or within the existing political systems. And with that follows a degree of pragmatism, a degree of cooptation, which kind of takes some of the radical edge of their policies. And I think Brexit is a very clear example of that, and how they have precisely modified their language from being about leaving the EU to now reforming the EU. So my first set of questions then is, given this rhetoric on reform, how do you assess kind of the more longer term impact on institutions such as EU, such as NATO, and such as UN? And then more kind of a political or normative question, given that there is a crisis of confidence in these institutions, at least in parts of the political spectre, should they not seek to reform? Or are you kind of advocating more of a return to or preservation of the kind of the former status quo? Then my second observation. In general, I would say that these movements are more united in what they oppose when it comes to the international sphere than in what they're actively advocating for. So they're more united in their critique than in kind of the specifics of their alternative visions when it comes to the international sphere. They do share a very specific kind of twofold idea on sovereignty, on protection of sovereignty, centered on culture, tradition on the one hand, and Hungary is by no means the only country speaking of kind of a Christian Europe, and on borders on the other. But in terms of, for example, economic protectionism, their policies are far more scattered, from kind of advocating for classical neoliberal policies, free trade and so on, to kind of adopting more the leftist stance on protectionism, as we see in France. But there's little kind of fundamental critique, for example, of neoliberal capitalism as such. But, and this is my final point, there is a sovereignty here that is also connected very intimately to the international sphere, and specifically in kind of the limits to what the international community can do. This is, of course, connected to kind of the debates between cosmopolitanism versus communitarianism, responsibility to protect, and so on, but it also reaches broader than that. And I would argue that this is where we've seen the most influence from Russia in recent years, in the language around NGOs. And what I would argue is a form of kind of repoliticization of an international civil society that has been largely depoliticized in the years after 1989. And in part, we've seen this rhetoric personified in attacks against George Soros, the Jewish Hungarian-American philanthropist and hedge fund tycoon. We've seen that in the US, we've seen it in Poland, in Hungary, we've seen it also in Norway, though on the left, and we've seen it in Israel. But its ramifications are broader, and it speaks to kind of an attempted boundary redrawing of what the international community can and should do. So on a more abstract level, and this is where I want to push you then a bit, is that I think values and morality at the international level will be far more politicized in the years to come. And this obviously has potential ramifications for international society and international politics, and thus also foreign policy. So my second set of questions then, what do you kind of see happening to the post-1945 liberal visions of international community? And does your optimism also extend to this dimension of international politics? And then very lastly, given that you have focused on kind of the populist right today, I would be curious both about your definition of populism here, but also about how the left, the populist left, fits into your analysis. So 3 sets of questions, one on reforms and institutions, what kind of long-term effects, and more politically, should they seek to reform? The other on the value dimension, what do you see kind of happening to the liberal ideal and the post-1945 visions? And then thirdly, where the left fits into your analysis. Thank you.
Okay, then it's my turn. Thank you so much, Andy, for a very interesting and thought-provocative talk. My comments and questions will be focused a little bit more on the role of the EU and the role of the European countries in the context, as my field of competence is more the EU and European status rather than populism. But I will start with the comment to your definition of populism anyway. Because you characterize populism by simplicity, identity norms, and anti-pluralist. These are the concepts that you use. And at a recent seminar we had here at NUPI with Professor Roger Brubaker, he defined populism as something you could find at the whole spectrum of the political kind of spectrum, including in the liberal center. And that it has more to do with kind of a communication style and lack of faith in the existing system and a belief that radical change is possible. So with such a definition, you would also have kind of liberal populists, like Macron, for instance, but also Obama would fit that kind of definition. But none of them would promote simplicity, and both must be defined as pluralists. So my first I would like to hear your comments on that. But if we stick with the definition that includes far right, and I would also think that we can include far left policies, but I agree with Min that would like to hear your points on that as well. I will agree with you that populist European foreign policy will most likely not have any revolutionary effect on the liberal international order as such, even though it might very well have kind of real life consequences that, for a certain group, as Minda points to. But then I'm not so convinced if that is the case for American populist foreign policy and the foreign policy we now see under Trump, that could not have potentially revolutionary effects. And the reason why I think that European populist foreign policies will have more limited global effect is rather due to their size. Basically, I think it's unlikely that one European country alone will have the power to influence global order or global politics as such. And in areas where the European Union already has become an actor, a populist foreign policy in one or two member states will be modified due to the character of the EU and the various processes of Europeanization. And it's interesting to note that we do not see, as you mentioned as well, a pan-European nationalist or populist movement. But then again, I'm not so sure that this is the case for American populist foreign policy, though. As we have seen recently, the recent decisions made by Trump in relation to world trade, the withdrawal from the Iran deal, the Paris Agreement, and last but not least, the American withdrawal from Syria, are all likely to have, or could have potentially, kind of serious consequences that could potentially also affect the international order. And it could also seriously undermine multilateralism or even the liberal order as such, especially if he is re-elected and continue this kind of foreign policy. So my second question after the definition of populism will be, do you recognize this kind of difference between American and European foreign populist policies? And to what extent do you think that the EU as an actor and also as an institutional apparatus can play a modifying role when it comes to European nationalist populist foreign policies? And then to populism and Euroscepticism. I agree that Euroscepticism can be modified as a consequence of or has been modified as a consequence of Brexit, and that there are less focus on other countries kind of following the Brexit example, and more in these other European populist parties on more focus on reforming rather than leaving the EU in most far-right parties, and also far-left populist discourses. This is the case in France, as you mentioned, actually both for Le Pen and Mélenchon. However, the case in France for both Le Pen and however, it can also be argued that the populist approach has led to changes in the established parties and how they view the EU's role in the world. To some degree, it can be argued that they have adapted to the populist agenda. and that this has also affected EU's foreign policy as it is now defined in the global strategy with principled pragmatisms, changes in the neighborhood policy, and so on. So my second question would be, to what extent do you see the current changes in EU's foreign policy as a move away from its role as being some kind of guardian of the liberal order? And then finally, I would like to reflect on the ideas you presented in a interesting article a few years ago, long before populism had become as prominent phenomenon in national and international politics as it is today, concerning the EU as a quiet superpower. I wonder if this is still the case as you see it. Now we have discussed it this morning, so I have some ideas about your answer, but I still follow up with this question for the audience. I mean, is it still the case that a new geopolitical context with various forms of if not populist, at least nationalist foreign policy in terms of patriotism and sovereignty at least, coming from other global power players such as China, Russia, as well as US, will the EU still be this kind of quiet superpower? Okay, I think I end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I'm preparing a chair here. Now I think you have 6 or 7 really good questions that to kick you off, and then we open up for a conversation. We have until 3:30, right? So please.
So we had a long discussion this morning in a smaller group, so my colleagues will forgive me if I don't go question by question. I'm just going to pick on 2 that I think speak to issues different than the ones I discussed in the talk. The first has to do with whether or not this somehow has the weakness of populists somehow has nonetheless an effect on other parties, ruling parties, that are non-populist, or other countries, such that you would undermine national policies even if the populists don't have direct control, or European policy even if they're not in control everywhere. And I think the evidence, in fact the same evidence I put up, suggests no. That argument, which is intuitively very plausible to people, depends on what I think of as a politically comforting falsehood. And that politically comforting falsehood is, we are only opposed to migration because the populists made us do it. Okay? That isn't true about any country in the Western world. All right? So if you look at Obama's policy, he's the one that really started chucking migrants out, right? You look at Francois Hollande's policy, and these are not people who are pro-migration in that sense. It is comfortable for people on the left in Europe, among whom I include myself, and in the United States, to talk as if that were true. But it's not. And once you get beyond migration, it's difficult to make the argument that these populist policies are spilling over at all. There isn't even a prima facie case for that. So my answer is basically no. The other is about Trump. So I think that we have slightly more to fear from Trump, but consistent with the theory. So if I were to take the theory and ask the question that social scientists can and do ask, how does it explain variation across cases, across issues, across countries, across circumstances? I think the theory would suggest that Trump should be slightly more effective at implementing his policy than people in Europe. But this is a difference of degree within the same theory. So Trump also promulgates a doctrine of consensus at home and conflict abroad, and he is also hampered by the fact that we do not have consensus at home, and we have lots of issues in which the United States has common interests with other countries. And every time he comes up against one of those issues, be it we don't want to blow each other up in a war with North Korea, or be it we want to trade with our European partners, he starts to get into domestic political trouble. And that trouble can be with the Pentagon, it can be with Congress, it can, he started threatening NATO, and Congress said, we will vote unanimously to keep the United States in NATO, right? Well, at that point, it's the end of the story for Trump's policy, right? So the place where Trump can be a little more effective is because the United States is more powerful than most countries. It can achieve more unilaterally, and the President of the United States is a relatively powerful person in the narrow area of national security. And he is able to use national security as an excuse for trade policy. So basically, to a first approximation, I would say there are only 3 things that Trump has done in foreign policy that are of any real consequence so far. There are smaller things, defunding this and that, but you forget that Republicans have always done that. So set that aside, there are 3 things. Tariffs on China, sanctions on Iran, and the pullout of 2,000 troops from the Syrian border. Pretty much in 4 years, that's it. Okay? Now, notice about the first, the tariffs with China, that they are ostensibly and supported by Congress because they are ostensibly temporary. So these are bargaining tariffs. If you look at what Trump has done in other trade negotiations that he has settled, NAFTA, Korea, he's actually settled them on extremely favorable terms to the other side, right? So there's no reason to believe necessarily that these China tariffs are a new page in the decline of the global liberal order and all that. They're a tactic by a powerful country. Iran sanctions, I think it's easy to forget that the Republican Congress promised that it would revoke the Iran deal when it came into office, and Trump has simply done that. As a Democrat, I worry more about Trump because he's a Republican than because he's Trump. Because I think he's just pursuing a lot of policies in some places, like Iran, which are Republican policies. And finally, in Syria, I think this is a case where the American presidency has a remarkable power to just have troops do this and that. Even though he was strongly opposed by the Pentagon, strongly opposed by Congress, and is paying an enormous domestic political price now for this policy, he was able to do that little bit. So that's something, but it's not the end of the liberal order.
Okay, just to pick up the topic that Minda brought up, this idea that the war is over and the victors have lost somehow, because these populists have somehow changed the nature of international cooperation and pose some kind of barriers to what is to be expected from international cooperation, if I understand you correct.
Right.
And also the Pernille's point that some of the agenda of the populist parties are picked up by mainstream parties. How do you view that?
So there are charts that didn't appear in this talk because they're still unfinished, where we take every single issue we can think of that a populist party has ever mentioned or that is an important issue, and all the populist party, and we make that red, yellow, green chart, with 50 items across the top and 23 countries. This takes a long time because when you start asking questions like, what does Cyprus think about aid to Nigeria, you end up really having to do some research to figure this out. But I have a hard time finding anything in the European context. I mean, take Orban, for example. Orban is a gung-ho supporter of aggressive European policies in the Mediterranean, aid to countries in Africa. Yes, he spent a week saying he was opposed to it, and then quietly reversed his position and supports it. And by and large, these countries are extremely pro-NATO. The Poles, rabidly pro-NATO. I mean, pro-NATO to an absurd extent, in my view. So it's actually pretty difficult to find things where you have a serious populist shift. And remember, as was pointed out, I thought more clearly by the commentators than I made clear, since populists don't agree on anything except migration, it's very difficult to get a populist consensus around anything else. So even if they do have some quirky view about globalization, or some quirky view about, whether we should rescue Christians in this or that place, it's very difficult to get everybody else to think that that's a priority issue. So, for the moment, I think their effect on global debate is pretty modest. And I don't think that people like Erdogan or Modi or something are just saying, gee, we don't want to do anything until we know that the Hungarians think it's okay. You know, I mean, they're doing their own thing, and that's fine. But you know, I have yet to see the evidence.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to open for the floor for discussion, but I just have one question first. And in some sense, I hope you're right in your argument. But so we have to make sure that this is a correct argument. So and you have a very simple and clear and transparent model where you have a preference formation and the bargaining and the information.
I think of myself as a populist academic.
Yeah, and one of the points I think is really important is that when in the preference formation, you assume that kind of let's look at sovereignty and the slogan somehow. You said that they stress independence, sovereignty. But what if populists are more concerned about, let's say, economic inequalities, unfair distribution of benefits of international cooperation, etc. So, and I think that that's also part of the kind of movement, not only on the left but also on the right-hand side. So one thing, so I want to kind of question you a bit about your preference model. And the second is the aggregation of those preference or the bargaining situation. I fully understand, okay, Austria or Finland or Hungary couldn't derail the EU. But if France, if you had an election, let's say in UK, followed by an election in the Netherlands, Italy, maybe France is never likely to be kind of won by populists, but does it really matter that that, for instance, Germany and France are governed by fairly centrist politicians, and some of the smaller states have this populist influence? Or would it be different if France was governed by Madame Le Pen and or the leftist politician, or AfD was a big power in Germany? Or so is power somehow an aspect here in your model, in your bargaining model?
Yeah, it is, but I think that the populists still face these inherent constraints. So even a German populist government would have a hard time finding other things that it strongly supported doing. So migration is, as I said, a consensual issue. So we want to set aside the issues that are really, despite what we like to think, consensual issues in the world. Then you have, as was pointed out, a scatter of views about trade and stuff like that. You have a consistent domestic policy of giving, family aid and so on, but it's not really a foreign policy issue. So I actually have a hard time imagining what that world is like, where you have a coherent populist movement that then pursues some international objective. What international objective that we're not pursuing now? On the economic side, I do think that Danny Roderick is right, if you've read Danny Roderick's stuff, that globalization has come a long way, and there are many people who rightly think that the distributional costs of globalization or the failure to cushion globalization is a problem. And I think were that view to become a majoritarian view, then, as it may be close to becoming in some countries, for example, in the United States, you had both the right and the left speaking out against Pacific Trade Agreement. Then you would get movement in that direction, but not movement because the populists hold the view, but movement because that's a broad change in society and a broad change in the essential nature of an issue, which is we've had 50 years of trade liberalization, investment liberalization in the world that's been very successful, and we've gotten to a level where the marginal gains of further liberalization of investment and trade are lower, and you're getting down to issues which are of greater concern to countries in terms of the obstacles. So the trade-off is shifting against globalization. You can't continue policies forever. So I don't think it's impossible that we would move in that direction, but we're not going to move in that direction because 15% of the electoral spectrum takes over the policy and forces us to do it, or because they convince everybody else through rhetoric that it's true. We would move in that direction because it is true. And I think the only other place where you see meaningful, sustained populist activity, which was on the left, in Southern Europe, it's because another policy is real, which is Europe has pursued the euro, and the euro is, for some countries, a decidedly bad policy. I mean, you couldn't give an undergraduate explanation for why the euro was a good thing for Italy. There is no explanation for why euro is a good thing for Italy. It's not a good thing for Italy. The only thing that can be said for it is once you're in it, it's expensive to get out of it. I always joke with my European friends. I said, you know, you Europeans are about you act toward the euro the way Americans act toward foreign wars. So every 10 years we get involved in a foreign war. It's almost invariably stupid. And then after 2 years, people say, this was stupid to get involved in this war, Vietnam, Iraq. And people say, yeah, we know it's stupid, but now that we're there, we have to keep fighting it, you know? And so I do think that the euro is a little like that, and I can understand why my friends who voted for Cinque Stelle, crazy though they seem, are concerned about that in Italy. So I think there are real issues that can lead to opposition to the liberal order as we know it, but I interpret them as leading to that opposition, so migration, macroeconomic policy, to a certain extent trade, because they're real, not because they're populist.
Geir, please introduce yourself.
No, certainly. I'm Geir Flikke, University of Oslo. I found your argument very compelling, very convincing, and very persuasive. But I'm left with a question about the liberal order, because it seems to me that you analyze processes that are on the inside of the European Union and how these processes do not derail the liberal project of the European Union in foreign policies. I guess a critic would say that, well, what derails the European Union is not the populism on the inside, but the onslaught on the liberal world order from the outside. So you can have other versions of populism coming from other places in Europe where people are prone to take risks in a way that would jeopardize some of the values that are associated with the liberal world order as we see it here in Europe.
Like, for instance?
Well, the big neighbor Russia, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm a Russianist, unfortunately,
okay.
So that explains my question.
Okay.
On the other hand, and the other question would be on the domestic level again. It seems like populism also solves the question of domestic participation in countries, that you could perhaps mobilize people that otherwise would not be mobilized domestically in politics. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that particular account. Thank you.
I will leave the second question to other people because I'm not really a domestic politics expert. But on the first one, Russia. So let's just call it the Russia question. 3 years ago, when I last had leave, I spent 1 day a week at the German Marshall Fund. We were working on a project on Ukraine and Western response to Ukraine. And I was brought in as an EU expert, like how can the EU cooperate against Ukraine and so on. Answer, yes, amazingly well, but anyway. So I spent an entire year listening to lectures, briefings on Russia, going to Poland 3 times, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say, I came away with the view, and subsequently I found this is the view of a surprising number of people in the Russian studies community, that Putin is a remarkably risk-averse person, that in his policy, foreign policy, that he has concerns that are largely about the near abroad and Russia's only remaining Middle East ally, that he's cautious in pursuing costly strategies. So I think it's quite telling that Russia used frontline crack Russian troops in Ukraine for about 3 weeks, very effectively, and then just stopped. They didn't even win back the land they'd lost in the first summer of the war, let alone take a third of Ukraine, as they said. Why? And why did Putin offer families an incredible sum of money in Russian terms, never to talk about their sons who had fallen in that war? even though they numbered only a couple of hundred. And the answer is because this guy is doing this largely for domestic and kind of minimal foreign policy purposes, and doesn't want to bear large costs. I view the notion that he would suddenly wake up one day and say, I want to attack Poland, which is what most people in Washington think, as crazy. There's zero evidence that that's the case. We spend a lot of money selling weapons to the Poles, which I can tell you my friends in Washington love to do. Coming up with plans for lobbing cruise missiles on the Polish plane when the Russians come through. But I find it exceedingly unlikely that he will. It doesn't mean for sure that he won't. But I think the European policy toward Russia has been extraordinarily successful, right? I mean, the Europeans basically, at first inadvertently, and then through non-military policies said, here's a country, let's call it Ukraine, which is the most important country politically, historically, economically, and in security terms to Russia. It's ours now. Europeans hate this kind of talk because they say, we don't have spheres of influence, we're Europe, right? But the truth is, they took it, right? The Russians grabbed back Crimea, which wasn't really resisted by the Crimeans, and a bit of eastern Ukraine, which was resisted. But most of the country, 90% of the country now, is in the West for now and forevermore, right? You might not like what you got, but it's there. And that's an incredible success. Putin didn't do anything about it. He could have done something about it, but he didn't. So my view is Europe is much more powerful than it seems. Russia's more risk averse than it seems. And, you know, we should definitely be concerned about, you know, influence on elections and all that kind of thing, but this is a manageable threat.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an old age pensioner and independent analyst. I could feel very tempted to speak about Putin, whom I've been studying for more than 20 years, but I refrained from the temptation and rather go back to your presentation, Professor Moravcik, excuse me. I'd like to thank you for your very provocative and provocational presentation. Why was it provocational? You suggested that you have been criticized by a number of people for belittling the dangers of populist foreign policies. Now, is that really provocational? I'm not provoked by hearing it. I think that both you and your detractioners, at least as far as you have been presenting it today, have been defining populism as, in a very narrow sense, as right-wing populism. And of course it isn't like that at all. You have all kinds of populists, like, for example, one of the most influential persons in American politics in the last part of the previous century, Tip O'Neill. He is famous for one sentence, and that's all politics are local. And of course he included foreign policies. And if you look at his legacy in American policies, you don't find any barks and you don't find any bites. But he was a populist in the traditional, conventional sense, and also, like Mr. Trump, a very transactional person. So if we leave that for a moment, I'd rather say that why should anything you said was should be seen as provocative? I think the basic thing, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that you were so categoric in your predictions about the future developments concerning populist foreign policies. Why are populist foreign policies doomed to disappoint, doomed to fail? Why is something must occur? Do you agree with me that your, let's say, your views would be seen as slightly more credible if you diminished the predeterminist part of your presentation, to put it like that? Thank you.
Okay, I'll retitle the talk, Why It Doesn't Right Now Look as If Populists Are Affecting Foreign Policy. And I congratulate you on being an old age pensioner who's an independent analyst. I have that aspiration too. Only I'd like to analyze music, classical music, and not political science. And in lieu of answering your question about Tip O'Neill, I'll tell you a story. I used to live across the street from Tip O'Neill. He was almost never there because he just had a house in the district so he could be elected from it. Actually, he had a vacation house out on Cape Cod and another one in Washington. He was never there. But one day he came and he noticed that there was a big hole in the middle of the street because we'd been complaining to the city about this hole in the middle of the street and nothing happened. And he came home to drink with his Irish buddies, and so they're drinking, and he came and he looked at the hole and he said some things that I can't repeat in public, and at 7 o'clock the next morning the people came out and filled the whole of the street. So he was indeed a transactional politician and a very effective one.
Okay, you said there was no academic literature on populism.
No, I didn't say that.
On any implications on foreign policy.
Not much.
No, but I think that if you now, during the last few years, there's been a lot of writings on populism. But if you go back a few years earlier, there's a huge discussion, academic discussion on Eurosceptics.
Yes.
Right, and they separated between what they call hard Eurosceptics and soft Eurosceptics. Hard Eurosceptics are then somehow classified as principled opposition to European integration, whereas soft Eurosceptics are more gonna, we don't like this or that policy, but in general we can kind of accept the mainstream somehow. So is it so that you portray most populist parties in Europe today as being basically soft Eurosceptics? So you're in Norway, and in Norway we have an organization called No to the EU, who's leading the Norwegian kind of campaign against Norwegian membership to the EU. But I think most people who are members of that organization, they will be fairly supportive to the EU. It's called No to the EU, but they are supportive to the EU, but they are kind of against Norwegian membership in the EU. And at the same time, there would also be, most of them would also be, up until very recent at least, for 25 years, they've been supportive of a very rich cooperation with the EU, but not formal membership. So I would say most Norwegians are soft Eurosceptics. They are not hard Eurosceptics. So does that make any sense for you?
Yeah. So I guess in that language, I'm saying most current populists, and by the way, I deliberately tried to avoid the definitional debates or about it, but most populists are soft Eurosceptics who talk like hard Eurosceptics. But the basic argument is that actually makes political sense. If you have a right-wing coalition, or for that matter, a left-wing coalition, but it's just simpler because we're talking about the right wing here, consisting of nationalists who really are hard Eurosceptics and people who are at best soft Eurosceptics and perhaps really like the European Union, you're always going to have this tension between rhetoric and reality because you can't get to 50% and rule your country without dealing with it.
Okay, see, time is running out. So I would just like to thank, of course, I'll start with Minda for her comments and for Pernille for their comments and remarks, and then, of course, to Andy for first coming here, sharing your insights and wisdom with us, also kind of exploring your argument, as you did, inviting for a discussion on this. And I think that this is a really important topic. You have brought to the table a set of approaching it in a systematic fashion. You've made clear some kind of your model, and then we have to look into the strengths and weaknesses of that model. And of course, you have also sent out a warning to all of us, academics, journalists, politicians, to be cautious about kind of what kind of desires we would like to follow, and to have some kind of warnings out there about. And you've also instilled a bit of, let's say, positive optimism on the way forward. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Andy.
Thank you.